Hi, Pinar. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us in our first event of international talks on the present and future challenges to the responsibility to protect. I want to introduce you Pinar very briefly. She is ASO Prof at Hacettepe University, and she is also co-convener in visa intervention and responsibility to protect working group. So today we will discuss what is the responsibility to protect. We will call it R2P. We will discuss why it is so important for IR discipline, why we are discussing responsibility to protect, what are the pillars, what are the dimensions of the R2P. What was supposed to be changed with the adoption of the R2P report, and what are the discussions around the status and the expansion of the R2P as a concept. So to start with, I can introduce very shortly what is the responsibility to protect, to give a brief historical background. So during the 90s, the international society faced intrastate conflicts in Somalia, in Rwanda, in Bosnia, and in Kosovo. And the international society saw the failure of the United Nations. The United Nations was hugely criticized by the international society because of its failure to manage these humanitarian crises, to prevent these crises, or to stop genocide or ethnic cleansing in these countries. So after the Kosovo intervention by NATO, the then Secretary General Kofi Annan initiated the creation of a commission, which was the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, that prepared and published a report in 2001, which was the Responsibility to Protect report. That would be included in the UN World Summit outcome document in 2005. So what are discussed about the responsibility to protect are first of all about the status of this concept. Is it a concept, a legal document, a norm, a principle, or a framework? And I want to ask you why states were so willing to adopt such a document in 2005, and what were the skepticism about this document? What was the reason? What were the reasons behind the skepticism or the willingness to adopt this kind of document? How we can frame responsibility to protect around the prevalence of human security concept. What is the human security concept importance for the responsibility to protect? And lastly, what are the differences between humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect?
Now, the use of force, threat and use of force principle very strictly, because at that time we see some examples of interventions like Tanzania's intervention in Uganda, Vietnam's intervention in Cambodia, and India's intervention in East Pakistan. But in these interventions, which are referred to as first examples of contemporary humanitarian intervention, the intervening states were claiming the right to the inherent right of self-defense, because they were saying that they were threatened either by the influx of so-called influx of refugees, etc. So in that regard, we also, the Security Council was at a deadlock, and it could not either sanction an unauthorized intervention or sanction the use of force by itself, authorize the use of force for humanitarian purposes or other purposes. So this was very problematic in the Cold War era, and this is the time where we see the agenda for peace, where the deadlocks of the Security Council could be surpassed by the General Assembly, at least putting its moral and political weight to make states take sort of action. And in terms of the understanding of humanitarian intervention and the emerging and evolving understanding of human security, I would say that the 1990s was a critical turning point. Because in the Cold War, we have seen some developments with regard to the protection of human rights. We have the 1966 International Covenant on Political and Civil Rights and International Covenant on Social, Economic and Cultural Rights. These were the first hard law documents. The twin covenants were the first hard law documents, while the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was a soft law document. So this was an important change, and the consideration of human rights protection during the Cold War was important, but the general environment of the Cold War did not allow any focus on humanitarian intervention or human rights protection per se. But in the 1990s, with several cases, as you were mentioning, especially the very controversial case of Kosovo, or a late intervention example, Bosnia-Herzegovina, a very fatal example of inaction by the international community in Rwanda, and a failed intervention in the case of Somalia, led to the question. So, as you were saying, Kofi Annan then asked the question, if humanitarian intervention is unacceptable, what are we going to do in cases such as we have experienced in Rwanda or in Srebrenica? And after Rwanda, the motto was never again. And we have been saying that for the case of Darfur and then many other cases as well as Syria today. So the initiative of the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty was critical. The ICSS, the setting of it simply worked on the idea of the human security and collective protection of human rights, along with the question mark of, can we intervene, when and if we can intervene for humanitarian purposes. So the starting point of this independent commission, which had two co-chairs, one of whom was Ramesh Thakur and the other one was Gareth Evans, and there were committee members from different parts of the world. It was not a Western construct in general terms. So they have asked the question. They began with the question of intervention. The idea of the responsible to protect went beyond the idea of an intervention, because in terms of the general differences, when we look at humanitarian intervention, a basic definition includes items such as it's an intervention to stop already occurring mass atrocity crimes. So it happens after the fact. It happens after human suffering has begun. It can be undertaken by an individual state, a coalition of the willing, or a regional or an international organization. It doesn't require the consent of the state, or it doesn't require the authorization of the Security Council. So it is why it has been perceived as a right to intervene. So if a state wanted to intervene in a specific humanitarian crisis, it could, only if it wanted to. It did not have to. And in that regard, it did not seek for a legal ground. It could be legitimized or justified, but a legal commitment was not there. So in that regard, the question of humanitarian intervention pertains to the use of force only. Whereas when we are talking about the responsibility to protect, it is in certain terms narrower than humanitarian intervention, and in the meanwhile, much larger than humanitarian intervention. It is narrower in the sense that you were referring to the 2005 World Summit Outcome document. Under paragraphs 138 and 139, on the basis of 4 mass atrocity crimes. So in that regard, it is narrower than humanitarian intervention because there is no such limitation for humanitarian intervention. So it can be any sort of mass atrocity crimes. It doesn't have to pertain to these 4 crimes. Whereas in the case of R2P being larger than humanitarian intervention, it is because it involves the aspect of protection. And in that regard, it involves the aspect of prevention of mass atrocity crimes. So humanitarian intervention happens after the fact of the perpetration of the crimes. But R2P can happen at the level of prevention. And what is important in this regard, which I can relate to your question, what R2P status is today? Is it a norm? Is it a doctrine? Is it a principle, a framework, whatever it is? So in that regard, R2P in itself requires prevention. And in order for prevention to be successful, we have to first look at the state level, because R2P involves within it the understanding of sovereignty as responsibility. So every state has its individual responsibility to protect its population from these 4 mass atrocity crimes. I will just refer to the UN definition of R2P in order not to confuse people with the ICSS version, because this is which we can talk about on the basis of these 4 mass atrocity crimes. That is the definition, and every state has this individual responsibility, and this is the understanding of sovereignty as responsibility, which emerged with the work of Francis Deng and his colleagues on grounds of the understanding of the internal displaced persons. So this idea also belongs to the 1990s. It's nothing original that comes from R2P, but R2P has embraced this idea. So prevention can first happen at the level of the state, important, but the state may fail to uphold its responsibility. And this failure may be due to unwillingness or inability of the state. So in that regard, if the state is unwilling or unable to prevent these crimes, then it is the responsibility of the international community. And in that regard, the international community first has the responsibility to assist states, for states to accomplish their goal of prevention. But this refers to the responsibility to prevent. But sometimes the failure is beyond escalation. So let's say it's already escalated, then the international community has a responsibility to react. And this reaction doesn't have to be with the use of force. On the contrary, the use of force is a last resort, which should be determined on a case-by-case basis. So this is not a general rule. There's no general rule that says to apply the use of force, a humanitarian intervention, in all escalated cases. So when we look at the World Summit Outcome document, the 2 paragraphs, we see that the UN Security Council is the sole authority which can authorize R2P action, especially related to the use of force. And in that regard, first off, it has to apply measures under Chapter 6 of the UN, the Pacific Settlement of Pacific Measures. And then it refers to Chapter 8, resort to regional agencies, because regional organizations are vital in terms of responding to atrocity crimes, because they are at the immediate neighborhood and they have the facts, they are closer to the facts, they know the region, they know the peculiarities of a situation. So in that regard, Chapter 6 and Chapter 8 come first. And then under Chapter 7, we can apply, let's say, under Article 41, certain coercive measures, but these are short of use of force. So it still doesn't involve the use of force. We can apply sanctions. And then only as a last resort, if the Security Council can manage to adopt a resolution, then the use of force can be applied. So in that regard, there are huge differences between the understandings of the responsibility to protect and humanitarian intervention, because, as I said, the humanitarian intervention is perceived as a right to intervene, and this is highly problematic. But in the case of responsibility to protect, we are not talking about a right. We are talking about a legal duty of states to protect their populations on their territory. And I call this a legal duty because there are parts of international law, like humanitarian international law, international criminal law covenants, to which many states of the world are party to. So they have a legal obligation, independent from R2P, but also within the context of R2P. So in that regard, R2P is highly different. And at the second level, the international community has a responsibility to protect these vulnerable populations. And again, we are not talking about a right. But here we are not referring to a legal responsibility, because as the way the 2005 World Summit Outcome Document paragraphs were constructed, they did not want a legal responsibility, especially the US resisted this idea. It did not want to talk about a legal duty of the internet. So you can talk about a moral responsibility or a political responsibility, whatever you would like to call it. So in general terms, when we think about R2P, what its status is, when we look at the literature, there are different approaches to it. Some people call it nothing but a hot air balloon. Some call it an old wine in a new bottle. These are the more skeptic ones, or like negatively criticizing ones. But for proponents of R2P, some call it a norm. Some call it a political norm. People like me call it a moral or ethical norm. And we can, at the very basis, we can call it a principle or a framework. As I said, there are different opinions on this, and interpretations differ, but in most comprehensive terms, we can see it as a norm and as a framework, because those who call R2P nothing new, an old wine in a new bottle, and a possible Trojan horse, or something, a concept that brings nothing new to the table. In that regard, well, we have to give some credit to them, because R2P in itself, the idea of soul from the 1990s with Francis Tang, and based on the work on the IDPs. So it is nothing new. Humanitarian intervention was there, like authorization of the use of force under Chapter 7. It's a well established in terms of international practice. So these are not new. But what is very original about R2P is the idea of prevention and the responsibility of the international community. So, and this framework brings with it adherence to international humanitarian law, adherence to international criminal law, adherence to international protection of human rights, or international covenants, etc. So it has a legal aspect to it, but R2P itself is not a legal norm, at least not yet. But definitely not, it's not going to become a legal norm soon. So I will leave that discussion to another question.
Okay. So just to summarize a little bit what you have told us, we can talk about 3 pillars of the R2P. We have this, the responsibility lays on states primarily to protect their population, and also the international community has the responsibility to assist the state to fulfill this responsibility. And if the states intentionally or unintentionally fails to do so, so international community has another responsibility to fill the responsibility to protect the vulnerable populations. And also we have talked about the prevalence of prevention with the responsibility to protect. So another important shift of with the responsibility to protect, another important shift of paradigm was perhaps the transformation of concept of sovereignty itself. We are not, when we talk about the responsibility to protect, we are not talking about an immune sovereignty, but we are talking about a responsible sovereign in the framework of responsibility to protect debates. And with the responsibility to protect report, we started to discuss the intervention, not in terms of whether or not to intervene, but the literature started to think about how to intervene, what can be the mechanisms to prevent the commitment of mass atrocity crimes, how we can realize the prevention itself. And the use of force is in international law. The use of force can only be authorized by the UN Security Council, which was the main problematic issue since the beginning of its foundation, the big decisions cannot be decided by the UN Security Council permanent members. And after the responsibility to protect report was adopted, UN Security Council did not change. So today we have to rely on the UN Security Council for the implementation of the of some pillars, not all the responsibility, but some pillars of the responsibility to protect. And in this regard, Libya intervention was promising for the implementation of R2P. I think we can say that Libya case was promising because the UN Security Council members seemed to be anonymously on consensus on intervening to Libya, and also they have the permanent members decided to go to the International Criminal Court, which was for the first time. So after Libya, the international society, instead of evolving through more humanitarian approach, through more some human rights protection angle, it went back actually. So what happened after Libya, that we have today's humanitarian crisis in Syria, we have Myanmar, we have Rohingya, we have so much humanitarian tragedies all around the world. So what are the problems of UN Security Council, or what are the structural problems of the R2P that are avoiding international society to implement responsibility to protect, while we are watching every day such humanitarian tragedies all around the world?
Well, in general terms, as specifically to regarding the case of Libya, I think it was the worst thing that happened to R2P in general terms, because when we look at the development of events, like in Resolution 1970, as we were referring to, the Security Council referred the situation to the ICC, which was a promising situation, because like it's important. Well, so it's not like an immediate solution to the problem, but it is important that the UN Security Council was on consensus regarding the case of Libya. In the case of Resolution 1973, and there is a very small time period between the two resolutions, and it's a major change in terms of the authorization of the use of force, but it is a perfect example of the classical play in international politics. Like, it's not very different from the Cold War era or the 1990s, because the facts of the Security Council did not change. They did authorize the use of force with 5 abstentions. So it was not like an affirmative 15 votes. Unlike the Cote d'Ivoire, these are back to back. So the Security Council first authorized the use of force for the case of Libya, and a couple weeks later or days later, I can't remember the exact timing, but within the same month, they authorized with unanimity the intervention in Cote d'Ivoire, which was carried out by French forces. But in the case of Libya, the abstentions did not turn into veto, but they were quite strong abstentions. China's, Russia's, and Germany's and Brazil's abstentions were like strong abstentions, and they did object to a use of force, the authorization of the use of force, but they just did not veto, because, well, I'm not a realist scholar, but from a realist point of view, their immediate interest did not lie in Libya. And there was also regional support to the UN processes. The regional organizations were important. They had seen the immediate threat in that regard, and there was obvious hate speech with Muammar al-Gaddafi calling people as cockroaches, and that he was going to crush them, etc. So there was an imminent risk, yes, but the authorization of the use of force in that regard was problematic for the implementation of the responsibility to protect. And I have a kind of controversial point of view regarding the case of Libya, because Libya was definitely an R2P crisis in my point of view, but the implementation was not an R2P implementation. And that is to say, first of all, in terms of the way the Security Council grounded the intervention, did not have anything to the responsibility to protect. In both resolutions, 1970 and 1973, they only referred to the responsibility of the Libyan authorities. So they only made an explicit reference to paragraph 138. But nowhere in the resolutions, they referred to the responsibility of the international community. They never referred to paragraph 139. And if we look at the text of the resolution, they were authorizing the use of force on the basis of Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, that refers to Article 42, which is within the authority of the UN Security Council. So it is the classical language that we see in UN security resolutions. They did not authorize the use of force on the basis of undertaking the responsibility to protect. And again, as for those who refer to the resolution as a resolution that was grounded on R2P, they also referred to civilians, not the protection of the Libyan population. And the protection of civilians, the POC, is an understanding which has existed way before R2P. So when we look at the precise language of the resolution, we cannot necessarily say that it was authorized based on R2P. But as I said, it was an R2P crisis, and there was the humanitarian concerns in there. So of course we can see it as an R2P implementation. But in terms of the way the military operation carried out and the goals that were sought during the intervention, the way of operationalization was highly problematic, and it was a very bad example of R2P implementation, if we accept it as an R2P implementation. It was kind of quite contrary to the main idea and nature of what was tried to be done with the idea of R2P. So this is why in the literature people refer to R2P's death with the case of Libya and with the last nail on the coffin in the case of Syria. So Russia had already, well, not that Russia is a good example in terms of upholding responsibility to protect, but states which have abstained in the case of Libya for the authorization of the use of force, they used it as a pretext to block any decision on Syria. And this was just a pretext because we know where Syria's interests lie in the case of Syria. And even in the case of Syria, for instance, the use of force was not considered as a primary option, because on the territory as well, in terms of the operationalization of an intervention, Syria would be highly problematic if a military intervention was tried to be carried out. And although these were not included in the UN version of R2P, but the ICSS had the just cause threshold, as well as some criteria to implement the use of force, like having the right intention, decision by the right authority, reasonable prospects. For instance, when we look at the case of Syria, there were no reasonable prospects for carrying out a military intervention. And it is highly problematic, and a military intervention taken under these terms could be more harmful for the population in the end. But the question is, well, if we come to the responsibility of the international community, actually they haven't been there most of the time. We have exceptional example of Guinea, wherein preventive measures were successful, and they were able to stop the atrocities before they began. They worked on the early warning signs, and they were able to take precautions. The situation is still not very stable, but at least it did not escalate to the level of mass atrocity crimes. But in other cases, like we have, as you were saying, we have many other cases like Darfur, Myanmar, etc. So in that regard, the international community has been absent in terms of undertaking the necessary measures to stop the escalation of conflicts. And Syria has been a failure of not R2P, I would say, but the international community, because, as I said, useful to the population, but intervening, and they were fighting on the different sides, and they did not claim to do this on the basis of R2P. Luckily, they would discredit the norm even further, but they are fighting in there. So without the resolution, they are still fighting in there.
Mm-hmm.
And this will a huge display, especially in the neighborhood and all around the world. So in that regard, Libya set a bad example in terms of implementation, and it gave states which kind of resist R2P a pretext. For instance, in 2009, UN Secretary General, then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, has published the first comprehensive report on R2P entitled Implementing the Responsibility to Protect, which set the three-pillar implementation strategy for R2P, as you were referring to it. The first pillar refers to the protection responsibilities of the state, and the second pillar, international assistance and capacity building, and the third pillar, timely and decisive response. In that regard, in the literature also, as well as in international politics, the third pillar has been the most debated one, because under timely and decisive response, there is the component of the use of force. And after this report, there have been the Secretary Generals, Ban Ki-moon and Antonio Guterres, have published 10 reports on R2P, and the main focus of all these reports in terms of the implementation of R2P was on the preventive measures. So a silver lining maybe about the bad implementation case of Libya is that the focus, especially after 2011, has been turned a lot on prevention and preventive aspects. And this is not necessarily to say that the use of force component should be removed from R2P. It's not necessary, because in any case, it is connected to the UN Security Council, and the UN Security Council can hardly come to a consensus on that without one of the permanent 5 members vetoing it. But the silver lining is that maybe we should focus efforts more on preventive aspects in terms of capacity building, in terms of reading early warning signs, because the international community is not eager to undertake a radical action anyway. But if we can develop these capacities in terms of the internal capabilities of states and in terms of international communities' response to emerging cases, then the responsibility to protect will be a success story rather than a failure story of the international community.
Yeah. And as we do not have so much controversial issues about the responsibility to protect, we have another debates going around, and more importantly in these days, while we have the COVID-19 pandemic. So we can say that in the framework of R2P, we have 4 major crimes that are the subject of a responsibility to protect decision or action, which are war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. And also we have some discussions holding around the expansion of the R2P to natural disasters or to pandemics. So in IR, we have always major debates. We have always different interpretations of same concepts, of same events. So R2P is really important controversial debate for IR discipline. So in terms of, if we try to think about the impact of COVID-19 on the discussions of the R2P, so we are living in that the world is locked down because of the pandemic, and we have the breakout of supply chain. Each state close their borders to each other, but at the same time, states are needing each other maybe more than ever for food, for medicines, for vaccines. So cooperation is so important in these times, but cooperation is also refused by each state. So in these interesting times, when we think about the future of responsibility to be taken by the international society, how we should think about this responsibility while we think about a future economic crisis, while we think about a future food crisis or medicine crisis that are ahead of the international society. There are, and also a second question would be, there are also some discussions telling us that vulnerable populations under present mass atrocity crimes commitment, in fact, will be more and more vulnerable to these crises, to the food, medicine, and economic crisis. And there is a fear that mass atrocity crimes can become widespread. For example, in the Philippines, the President Duterte told the police to shut down each person that are not who are not respecting the lockdown measures, for example. So in this framework, do you consider that R2P could or should be expanded to these kind of crisis, to these kind of humanitarian problems? Or it would be worse for the responsibility to protect that is under so much debate?
Well, it's actually a great question and brings a lot of controversy. In order to answer your question, let me begin with the present challenges to R2P. One of the issues, as I was saying, the 10 reports by the UN Secretary Generals, the last two of them were discussed in formal debates under the UN General Assembly. The first formal debate was in 2009, and then until 2018, there were informal interactive dialogues. And then with the efforts of the states within the group of friends of responsibility to protect, they were able to bring this to the formal agenda of the United Nations General Assembly, first in 2018 and then consecutively in 2019. This was a major development because, for instance, in the case of Russia, despite the fact that it tried to justify its actions on grounds of R2P when it was intervening in South Ossetia, Russia is now a staunch objector to R2P, and it says that R2P will be dismissed like its predecessor humanitarian intervention. There are other states resisting R2P. In total, there are 5 states. Among these are Syria, Venezuela, and these states are known for their perpetrations of different crimes against humanity or war crimes, etc. So in that regard, there is a small number of states resisting to R2P or rejecting R2P. But still, it doesn't change the fact that the most prominent challenge is that despite the fact that the rest of the states place prevention as the most important aspect of R2P, and they are in consensus that prevention comes first and we have to prevent the populations. As every Secretary General underlines, there is a huge gap between promises and practice. So this gap has been widening with an increasing number of different humanitarian crises in different parts of the world, not only in Africa, but also in the Middle East, in Asia, etc. So also we see the refugee protection crises. Refugee protection by itself, there's a legal framework to protect refugees, but under R2P, there is a relation in terms of, there is a connection with the protection of refugees, because the presence of IDPs means that a state is failing to uphold its responsibility towards its population. And refugees, when as they cross borders, they become part of the population of the state within which, on the territories of that state. So in terms of the radicalization of refugees, the bad implementations toward refugees or bad treatments to refugees, these we can also consider under R2P as well. So in that regard, in terms of implementation, there's a huge gap between the promises made on the 2005 consensus and what is in practice today. So we don't have necessarily many good examples of R2P's implementation, and this is why there are a lot of works in the literature criticizing R2P.
Yeah.
But in my opinion, it's not the failure of R2P, it's the failure of the international community and the UN system, the Security Council-based implementation strategy. So in that regard, on the basis of that present challenge, it is highly problematic for R2P to be implemented in a timely and decisive manner. And the only thing, the most, let's not say only thing, but let's say the most prominent thing that made the 2005 consensus possible was the limitation of R2P's scope to the 4 grave crimes. So in the ICSS version, for instance, they were referring to cases of humanitarian crises arising from natural disasters or pandemics. But this was left out of the discussion for the 2005 World Summit Outcome document. So if we try to impose such definition into the current scope of R2P, that would kill the norm. It would complicate the things further. It's already problematic in terms of implementation, and trying to expand the scope or expanding the scope of R2P would be counterproductive. But this doesn't mean that we should not take into consideration situations such as natural disasters or pandemics. So we need to focus on early warning signs, and we have to recognize that pandemics may create extra hard conditions for already vulnerable populations. And we should not let states or groups within states to weaponize pandemics, because access to health facilities, or like in the case of Rohingya, for instance, like if there is something that is already going on, pandemics like COVID-19 can be used against these populations. It is enough if you cut their health services. So pandemics can be weaponized by states. And in order to take precautions under R2P, in this regard, we don't need to define a situation of pandemics. We don't need to define a situation of natural disasters. It is by definition there. So as soon as we see the early warning signs, we can take the precautions. So this can be under monitor of the international community. And this actually brings us, as for future challenges, this also brings us to a question of UN reform. And this is the part that I would be considered as an idealist or a utopian by cynics. But R2P is a good example of why there should be a UN reform. So in that regard, the Security Council system, current system, not only for the authorization of the use of force, I'm like, we should refrain from authorizing the use of force under R2P. There should be early action. But as we have seen in the case of Syria constantly, Russia, sometimes along with China, vetoed or threatened with veto draft resolutions. So no sort of action could be taken not involving the use of force. So in that regard, R2P's implementation should pertain to, especially to the responsibility to prevent, especially the first two pillars. Because this is where we don't necessarily need the Security Council to act. We have the UN General Assembly, and there is the Human Rights Council, which is also problematic in terms of the member states' behavior, chosen elected member states' behavior from time to time, but we can utilize the Universal Periodic Review system. So the signs are there. So in that regard, we can use those signs and we can take precautions to prevent. And pandemics such as COVID-19, well, we see that it will change international relations, it will change domestic structures, it will change many things in our lives, but these can be early warning signs for us as a whole and at large, so that we can take the necessary precautions so that they cannot be weaponized by groups within states or by states authorities against certain populations. So this allows us, even outside the context of the responsibility to protect, it would make things much easier if we took it outside R2P, because it is already kind of controversial in many respects for many states. So we can think about lawmaking in that regard, and we can talk about multilateralism, but these are topics where the international community is failing very hard. And in that regard, it's not a problem pertaining only to R2P. It's a general problem, and R2P is only an example in that regard.
So thank you, Pinar, for answering my questions. Now we can start to take questions from our audience. Thank you to Dilek. She mentioned the code of conduct proposed by France in 2013, and she is asking about the accountability, coherence, and transparency group that was launched to focus on improving the working methods of the Security Council. And she is asking, is it possible to ban the use of veto on these subjects, and R2P can be implemented more easily?
Well, this initiative was, well, in terms of the idea of the code of good conduct, this was not something new. This was previously was provided by the ACT group, and then the ICSS had mentioned it in terms of defining the Security Council as the main right authority. And they said there should be a voluntary restraint on veto. And then most recently, France and Mexico in their initiative again brought this to the Security Council as for discussions, and under the General Assembly, sorry, not Security Council. When I work on the formal debates regarding R2P, I see that there is a lot of reference to the code of conduct, why it is necessary. And quite interestingly, in the previous years, in the prior reports, the representative of Sudan, for instance, saying that giving the authority to the Security Council to decide on R2P cases is like trusting a wolf with sheep. So even Sudan was critical of this. In my personal point of view, Code of Good Conduct is a very important initiative, and it should be realized. So at the ideational level or the conceptual level, it is something that should be. But as Dilek is now saying, France announced that it would not use its veto right on these subjects. Unfortunately, France is the only country doing this among the permanent members. And there is no way that the US will do that. We have seen this many times in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They are acting even legally established rules and frameworks, etc. Russia would never do that. Russia is dismissing it in general terms. China is not against R2P totally, but it's always refers to the prevention responsibilities, and it says that the use of force should only be a last resort. But again, I don't think that China would be willing to not to use its veto, because at every occasion, necessary and unnecessary, it has used the veto. And the UK goes along with the US, and it has been among the states which have been intervening in the Middle East along with the US. So in terms of forecasting, I don't see it to be possible. I mean, France will probably be the only permanent member that will adopt this decision and stick to this decision. France can do that, would do that. It's a high possibility. Otherwise, it wouldn't bring the initiative anyway. But I don't see that possibility as high as for other permanent members. I don't see it happening soon. or in
Yeah,
the near future.
it will not be supported by the other members. We have another question by Sıla. How can the civil society contribute to the R2P? In fact, it's very important, especially in our days. The role of civil society is hugely important to do some pressure on governments in democratic countries, mostly. But how you can explain if civil society can play a contributive role to the evolution and to the acceptance of R2P?
Well, first, I would like to thank Dilek. That was a very nice question. And I would also like to thank Sıla for this very nice question, because it's actually a very important question. In general terms, when we think about R2P, we refer to one of the biggest problems about R2P is that the state-centric approach to upholding the responsibility to protect. Because one of the reasons why R2P is criticized is that it is based on Western values. And on the one hand, it is like in third world critiques, third world approaches, critiques to R2P, it's just like directed towards a certain group of states, like the global South. And most Western states see this as a foreign policy matter, which means that they don't have to think about R2P in terms of their own domestic systems, that they do everything very well, but it's a foreign policy matter that they may need to tend to regarding the situations in other countries. And this state-centric approach has been very problematic, because at that point we missed the core of the idea behind R2P, because R2P begins at home. Like in the saying of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, peace at home, peace in the world.
Yeah.
If you apply R2P at home, it can be applied globally as well, because if you are successful in terms of applying R2P at the grassroots level, if we can, like before even civil society, if we can make this understood by individuals, and then it will become possible to prevent the happening of atrocity crimes at the domestic level. So civil society plays a great role in that regard, because they can help in terms of raising consciousness within the public, and education is an important part of this. And R2P also, in the current formal debates under the UN, it has been discussed in relation to the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, and specifically Sustainable Development Goal 16, in terms of achieving peace within states. So in that regard, civil society plays a very important role, and not only in terms of creating consciousness, but also in terms of collecting early warning signs and giving primary reactions, or reporting the situation to related authorities. In that regard, NGOs and other initiatives at the grassroots level can play a critical role. And it is important also to consider education at this level, because if we can create conscious individuals, rather than if we can raise them as individuals who value diversity in terms of xenophobic or afraid of different cultures, afraid of different nationalities, if we can raise them as individuals who appreciate multilateralism, who appreciate the variety within the society, then at that level we can easily uphold the responsibility to protect. When we are talking about the failure of R2P in many different cases, we can talk about attractive cases, or almost not over yet cases. But the rest of the world, in terms of their domestic affairs, they are living peacefully. So some states are upholding many different states are upholding their responsibility to protect. It's like, is the glass full, half full, or half empty, exactly. Sort of. So we generally look at the situation from the half empty perspective, which is important because we have to address those situations. But in the meanwhile, it is half full, because there are many states upholding their responsibility on a daily basis. And it is where the civil society and individuals specifically play a very important role, I would say.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. And I have a question sent privately, which is about the responsibility while protecting concept that was developed by Brazil mainly. So what is the difference between responsibility to protect and responsibility while protecting? Why Brazil suggested such a differentiation? How can we explain this?
Well, again, we go back to the case of Libya.
Yeah.
Thanks to bad implementation in the case of Libya, Brazil suggested the idea of responsibility AP. It is, in fact, again, nothing original because the ICSS already suggested what Brazil suggested within RWP. So the just cause threshold criteria and the application criteria for the use of force, the ICSS had already mentioned these, and what Brazil did with responsibility while protecting was to bring these once again to the table, because they were left out in the 2005 World Summit outcome documents, because the main aim was to limit the scope of R2P and leave out the controversial aspects. So that's the adoption of the document would be much more possible. So RWP in that regard is something complementary, and it relates to the implementation of the responsibility to protect at the level of the responsibility to react under Pillar 3 when we are talking about timely and decisive action through the use of force. So RWP in that regard complements how we apply, how we implement the use of force under more carefully and more responsibly to undertake interventions if we are like acting in the case of Libya, which was not necessarily very responsible in terms of the implementation.
Yeah.
And the idea of RWP was supported by then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. He also placed this in his report, and like this is an important initiative which needs to be taken into consideration. But after Brazil's term ended in the UN Security Council, it was also removed from the agenda because Brazil no longer pursues.
Okay.
I guess I'm losing my connection. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Everybody just froze.
Okay. So lastly, you have said that it was out of the agenda. And then did you add something when we lost your connection?
No, I just said it's just after Brazil's term ended, it did not pursue it. It's just plain simple international politics.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we have come to the end of our discussion. Thank you very much, Pinar, for joining us and for sharing your ideas and all this insightful information on the R2P with us. And thank you very much for all our participants, attendees to this event. I hope we will be gathered again in another international talk online series. Thank you very much, Pinar.
Thank you so much, Aslan. It was my pleasure, and really nice to see you again.
Yeah,
and I wish you success in the rest of your international talks. I hope that this was a good start, and I look forward to listening to the forthcoming ones. Again, thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you very much for accepting my invitation. Take care, everyone. I hope to see you soon in another event very soon. Bye.